For the remainder of Chapter 16, we're going to focus on two fairly unusual molecules called hemiacetals and acetals. Now these are going to be particular structures, and in that way they're going to remind you a little bit of functional groups, but we typically don't consider hemiacetals or acetals to be their own functional group. The reason being that, as we'll see, they can form and unform in nature very easily, and that's not something we usually think of being true of a functional group. So hemiacetals and acetals are not really functional groups unto themselves because they form when you have the presence of other more well-known functional groups. Let's focus on hemiacetals first. A hemiacetal is a molecule that forms when you have either an aldehyde or ketone present, and that aldehyde or ketone reacts with another molecule, an alcohol. So either you start with an aldehyde and you mix it with an alcohol and you get a hemiacetal, or you can start with a ketone and mix it with an alcohol and you'll get a hemiacetal. Now the reason we don't think of this as a typical formation reaction, and the reason hemiacetals aren't considered to be their own functional group, is that this is actually a very reversible reaction. In fact, in nature, anytime you mix aldehydes and alcohols or ketones and alcohols, you will instantly get the formation of some hemiacetals. What's tricky about this is understanding that that formation can be forward and then it can be reversed and unformed just as easily. So again, if you were to mix something like an aldehyde with an alcohol, you may form the hemiacetal right away, but that hemiacetal is just as likely to unform and turn back into the original aldehyde and alcohol molecules. So this is a reversible reaction, and that's why we don't think of hemiacetals as being their own functional group. To see how an aldehyde or ketone and an alcohol can react with each other, I'm going to draw out one way to think about the mechanism of this reaction. Now I'm going to put mechanism in quotes here because what I'm going to show you is not the true mechanism where I show all the movement of electrons, but rather it's a way to think about the net effect, or the way that the bonds are actually going to move around in this molecule. Let's consider the formation of a hemiacetal from a ketone and an alcohol molecule. We know that both aldehydes and ketones are based on the carbonyl bond. And if I'm going to draw a ketone, I know that it has to have two R groups. One thing you can do to help yourself draw hemiacetals is when you draw these R groups, don't draw an R group to the left and an R group to the right, but instead draw one of the R groups pointing more in a downward direction. The reason for this is it's going to leave room for the reaction that's going to happen on this ketone molecule. The same would be true if you were starting with an aldehyde. So your first molecule is a ketone, which I have drawn in blue. Now I'm going to change to green and we're going to draw an alcohol structure. When we think of alcohols, we think back to chapter 14 and we remember that an alcohol has an OH group attached to the rest of the molecule. Typically we write the OH together, but in this case I'm actually going to draw the OH separated by the single bond that's there. The reason is, again, it's going to make it easier for us to understand what happens over the course of a hemiacetal formation. Of course, that alcohol group is joined to a carbon chain. It could be very short, like methanol or ethanol, or it could be a larger structure. To understand how hemiacetals form and unform, I suggest that you think about the movement of the electrons in the following way. Essentially, the two bonds that already exist and are facing vertically, as we've drawn them on the screen, are actually going to break. This single bond that separates the oxygen and the hydrogen is actually going to break and donate its electrons to form a new bond between the carbon and the oxygen. So you'll end up crossing out or erasing the bond between the oxygen and the hydrogen and forming a new bond between the carbonyl carbon and the oxygen from the OH group. That's the first part of the electron movement. The second part is almost a mirror image that's going to happen on the carbonyl bond. In this case, the electrons from the carbonyl bond are going to move sort of upward as we've drawn it here, and you're going to actually form a new bond between the carbonyl's oxygen and the existing hydrogen from the alcohol group. Now, just like we saw in the OH bond, we are going to have to use electrons to do this. But because the carbonyl bond is a double bond, we only need to use half of the bond. In other words, I'm only going to have to erase just one of those lines. So I'll still have a single bond connecting the carbon and the oxygen. So this is the type of electron movement that happens in a hemiacetal reaction. And as you can see, it is a little bit complex, but it's much easier to see if you draw it out in this particular arrangement. Let's see what we actually form as a result. From the ketone, we're still going to have the R groups remaining and still connected to the carbon that they originally were connected to. The carbon is still going to be connected to that oxygen, but this is where the carbonyl bond was, and it's now been reduced to a single bond. I'm going to have a new bond between that oxygen and the hydrogen, which was originally, again, part of the alcohol. So there's my new OH bond that's formed. Now this goes both ways because I also have a new bond that's formed between the carbon on the carbonyl group and the oxygen from the alcohol. So essentially we've split the OH group in half, and we've allowed the hydrogen from the OH group to connect with the oxygen on the carbonyl, and we've allowed the oxygen from the OH group to connect with the carbon from the carbonyl. This structure that we now have is what we would call a hemiacetal. And you'll notice that there's a couple different aspects of it that are unique. It has an OH group, so it's almost like it has an alcohol part, but at the same time, if you look at the structure that's connected to the carbonyl carbon, this part resembles the ether functional group. So it's a little bit like having an alcohol group and an ether group both directly connected to the same carbon. Again, this is probably one of the trickier structures to draw when you're starting with an aldehyde or ketone and an alcohol and asked to draw the hemiacetal product, only because there is so much bond movement. So let's do some practice. Let's predict the products that form when we put together an aldehyde and an alcohol. Remember that when you're asked to predict or draw the products of a hemiacetal formation, I recommend thinking about it in the same visual way that we just did on the preceding slide. Draw the C double bond to O so that it's lined up next to the OH bond. This will make it easier for you to see how all the electrons move. So here's an example. Draw the hemiacetal that forms when 1-propanol reacts with formaldehyde. So 1-propanol is our alcohol, and formaldehyde, of course, is our aldehyde. Take a second, first establish what the structure is of 1-propanol and what the structure is of formaldehyde, and then see if you can draw them together. Go ahead and pause the video. Okay, so let's look at first of all what the structure of 1-propanol and what the structure of formaldehyde is, and then we'll look at how to put them together. 1-propanol simply means that I have 3 carbons with an OH group on the very first or the very last carbon, depending on how you draw it. Formaldehyde, of course, is our simplest aldehyde, and it's drawn of just a carbonyl bond connected to 2 hydrogens. Now, to predict the hemiacetal that'll form from these, I'm going to align them the same way I did on the previous page, which is to say I'm going to draw the carbonyl bond for the formaldehyde, then I'm going to draw the hydrogens so that they're out of the way from the reaction that I'm about to complete. There's my formaldehyde, and now I'm going to line up the propanol. Again, if you hadn't done this already, it's okay to pause the video here and give it a try. So when I draw this, I think it's easiest to orient the OH bond so that it is parallel to the C double O bond, and then draw the remaining structure. Again, because it's propanol, I have 3 carbons with the required hydrogens attached to them. Now I can go on to complete this into a hemiacetal structure. Again, I like to think about this as this bond falls down, this bond goes up, and I'm going to form 2 new bonds where those electrons have moved to. So in the process, I break the single bond and I reduce the double bond down to a single bond. The structure that I get as a result is my hemiacetal. The carbonyl carbon is still connected to the 2 hydrogens from formaldehyde. It's still connected to the oxygen, but now it's in a single bond. And of course you can draw that OH with a single bond between it, or you can just draw it together as I've done here. The carbonyl carbon has a new bond to the oxygen that was originally on the alcohol, which is still connected to whatever was part of the alcohol, in this case, those 3 carbons. So this resulting structure is our hemiacetal that would form between 1-propanol and formaldehyde. And again, this is a very reversible reaction. That means that as soon as I mix 1-propanol and formaldehyde, I will make this hemiacetal, but at the same time, as soon as that hemiacetal exists, it can reverse backwards into 1-propanol and formaldehyde. Let's look at why it's so important to understand a reaction that really is very reversible. The thing about hemiacetals is that they naturally form. So anytime you have alcohols and aldehydes or alcohols and ketones present, you will form a hemiacetal. And that's going to end up having some interesting consequences because one place that happens is right inside the human body. So all the time when you have these molecules, an equilibrium will form, meaning you have a balance of the carbonyl aldehyde or ketone and the alcohol along with the hemiacetal. Remember from general chemistry that equilibrium means you have a balance. It doesn't necessarily mean you have equivalent amounts. And that's actually what's kind of interesting here, is that the hemiacetal is generally much less favorable. It's a much less stable structure. So when you do mix something like 1-propanol and formaldehyde together, you will form some hemiacetal, but it's an incredibly small amount. For most molecules, it's something like 99% of the molecules are going to remain separate, while less than 1% is going to form the hemiacetal structure. So it gets us to beg the obvious question, which is why does this even matter? And the reason it matters is that there's one major exception to this rule. Hemiacetals are generally less favorable, but hemiacetals are actually favored if the carbonyl carbon and the OH are on the same molecule. So let's just stop and let that sink in here. So I just told you if you take something like an aldehyde and an alcohol and you mix them together, you'll form a tiny little bit of hemiacetal, but mostly you'll just have aldehyde and alcohol. The exception is if the aldehyde and the alcohol are actually on the same molecule, meaning you have one structure that has both of those functional groups present. Now, we haven't done a lot of molecules in this class that have more than one functional group because we're trying to keep things simple. The human body is not quite so nice. The fact is, all monosaccharides, meaning all simple sugars, actually perfectly meet this description. They have a carbonyl bond because all monosaccharides are either aldehydes or ketones. And, as we're going to see in chapter 22, all monosaccharides also have many OH groups connected to them. Without going into too much detail, let me give you an example of what a monosaccharide might look like. It might have an aldehyde group on one end, and then a long carbon chain, which is going to have OH groups all along the backbone. The consequence of this is that you don't get this molecule staying the way we currently have it written on the page. What actually forms is that the OH that's connected to that carbon backbone can actually react with the aldehyde. And one way to think about this is think about this as having a head on the molecule and then having a tail. In this way, it's almost like the head coils around and bites the tail. Now that sounds really complicated, but what we're going to see in chapter 22 is it actually has very predictable results. And the main result is that when we end up seeing monosaccharides, they're generally going to be in a ring structure with OH groups all around the ring. The reason the ring has an oxygen bond in here is that this is actually going to be a hemiacetal bond. So if you've taken a biology class before and you've seen the structures of sugars, simple sugars like glucose, fructose, and so on, the ring structure that you're seeing is actually a hemiacetal bond, which, as you can imagine, starts to become really important as you get into biochemistry and into chemistry 123. So hemiacetals are a little bit technical to draw, but they're important to understand because they explain why these molecules exist as rings, even though generally we see that hemiacetals are less favorable. Again, if the carbonyl bond of an aldehyde or ketone is on a completely separate molecule than an alcohol, you'll form a little tiny bit of hemiacetal. But if the carbonyl bond is part of the same molecule that has the alcohol, you'll find that that molecule overwhelmingly spends the majority of its time in a ring structure or a ring conformation. Hemiacetals are not the end of the line as far as this reaction goes, because believe it or not, they can actually continue reacting to form one additional type of bond, and that's an acetal or an acetyl bond. So think of acetals as basically being one more step along in hemiacetal formation. When you have an aldehyde and an alcohol, or a ketone and an alcohol, you can make a hemiacetal. If you have a hemiacetal and you add additional alcohol, you can actually create a whole new bond that gives you an acetal formation. Now, the reason that this doesn't always happen is that the hemiacetal can form under any conditions, and it's favored if the two structures are on the same molecule. Acetal formation, on the other hand, requires the presence of acidic conditions, and it's actually a much simpler reaction as far as what the mechanism looks like, because it essentially is just a dehydration reaction. So here's what an acetal formation looks like. Let's start out just by thinking about a general hemiacetal structure. We've seen that hemiacetals have an OH group connected to a carbon. They have the two R groups, or hydrogens, that were part of the original aldehyde or ketone, and then they have that ether-like connection between the carbonyl carbon and whatever was originally connected to the alcohol. So this is our hemiacetal structure. If you have acid present, and I'm going to represent acid with a little H plus here, if you have acid present and enough alcohol still left in your solution, you can actually get this to react one more time. So let's consider this reaction between the OH and another alcohol. I'll change colors again to make this a little bit easier to see. Let's say I have another alcohol, just a general structure that's made up of an OH group connected to an R. This might be the alcohol that was originally used to form the hemiacetal, or it could be a totally different alcohol. What I'm going to do is essentially perform a dehydration reaction here. The OH from the alcohol, the OH from the hemiacetal and the H from the alcohol are actually going to bond together to form a water molecule. Again, I'm not going into the full structure here and the full mechanism, but if you think about this just as popping off the OH and the H group, you'll correctly draw the final structure. Going back to my original hemiacetal, I keep the R groups, I keep the carbon, and what I'm also going to keep is the oxygen part of the ether-like bond that was originally part of the alcohol. I'm still going to have a bond here, but what that bond is actually going to form is the O going to the R of the alcohol. So in this case, I've basically popped off the OH that was part of the hemiacetal and replaced it with another alcohol minus its hydrogen. So I really have two ether-like structures here. There's the ether-like structure here, and then there's still the original ether-like structure of the hemiacetal. So it's almost like a diether, where both of those ethers are connected to the carbon of the carbonyl bond. Again, this is a reversible reaction, but it requires the presence of acid. Notice that the byproduct of this reaction is water. So there tends to be a little bit of an interesting equilibrium that gets established here. If you mix an aldehyde with an alcohol, it'll generally form a little bit of the hemiacetal, but if there's a lot of acid present and enough of the alcohol, it can go on to form an acetal. Same thing would be true if I took a ketone and an alcohol and mix them together. Again, I form a little bit of the hemiacetal, but if there's acid present and enough of the alcohol, it goes on to form the acetal. I can reverse this formation. Given the presence of enough water, I can actually force this mechanism backwards. So if I add water, I'm actually going to shift the equilibrium of this reaction backwards, and it'll cause my acetal to break up back into the original hemiacetal and perhaps even all the way back to my original aldehyde or ketone and alcohol. That's often called acetal hydrolysis. It just means that this whole system is in a gigantic equilibrium where you have all these different possible structures, and the part of the equilibrium that's favored depends on conditions like, do you have a ring formation? Do you have acidic conditions? Do you have enough alcohol? And do you have a lot of water? As you can imagine, it gets pretty complex. But don't worry too much about interpreting this, because we're going to see it more in chapter 22, and that's where we'll really focus on the structure. For now, let's just do one more practice where we deal with forming an acetal. So I'm going to give you pretty much the exact same problem as I did before, but now I'm going to have you draw both the hemiacetal and all the way through to the acetal. So in this example, I'm asking you to write the product that forms from excess 1-propanol, meaning plenty of alcohol, plenty of propanol, and formaldehyde, that's our aldehyde, in acidic conditions. So because we have so much alcohol and we have acidic conditions, this isn't just going to form a hemiacetal, it's going to form an acetal. You can draw the acetal directly, but a lot of people are a little more comfortable working one step at a time. So let's start with the propanol itself, CH3, CH2, CH2OH, and of course our formaldehyde. Take a second and see if you can draw the hemiacetal, which we've already done, and then complete it by forming the acetal. Okay, I'm going to do this two ways. First, I'm going to do it the long way, which is to show every step, and then I'm going to show you how to do the shortcut, which will take you straight from the propanol and formaldehyde to the acetal. Again, the easiest way to do these, especially when you're new at them, is to set this up so that your carbonyl bond is oriented parallel to the OH bond from your alcohol. And again, I'm going to do this first just by doing the acetal formation, the hemiacetal formation first. So again, these bonds are going to move. I'm going to end up breaking the double bond, breaking the single bond, and forming two new bonds. So the structure that we've already figured out that we get, but it's always good practice to do more than once, is an OH pointing up and an ether-like bond with a CH2, CH2, and CH3. This is my hemiacetal. Now, because I have excess 1-propanol, meaning I've got plenty of alcohol, I can assume that there's still more propanol floating around. And I'm going to draw it up here so that the OH groups are oriented near each other. The other thing I need to notice is that I said I'm in acidic conditions. If this was not done in acidic conditions, this is where the reaction would stop. It couldn't go any further. But because I have acidic conditions, I can essentially do a dehydration reaction, removing the OH from one side and the H from the other. Side note here, the way I've drawn this where the OH is removed from the hemiacetal is actually what happens in the real mechanism. In reality though, if you were to reverse this, I'll never know because all oxygens look the same when drawn on paper. So as long as you think of taking an OH off of one of those structures, you'll still get the right final answer. So I'll now redraw this so that I show my dehydrated structure, and that dehydrated structure is going to be my acetal. So here's the original formation I had for my hemiacetal, starting to run out of room, CH2, here I'm drawing an arrow, CH3, and I also now am going to have the oxygen from the alcohol connected to its CH2, CH2, CH3. Okay, so this is my acetal. This was my hemiacetal. So you can do it like that. The short way to do this is just to recognize what the alcohol is and attach it to the propanol. So let me show you a shortcut for a way to do this. Here I started out again with formaldehyde. One way to think about this is just to realize that by the time this structure is completely done, I'm going to have a single bond from that carbon, two single bonds rather, each one connected to an oxygen. And in this case, because all of the reaction was done with 1-propanol, I know that the propanol part is this 3-carbon chain. So I can just do CH2, CH2, CH3, and I can do CH2, CH2, CH3. Be warned, you're going to see these both as condensed structures and as line structures. In line structures, this is actually a fairly easy arrangement to recognize because there's not many places where we've seen a carbon sandwiched between two oxygens. Now, hemiacetal and acetal formation is a relatively tricky process to draw out the first few times, but what'll help is if you start to do them more and more for practice, you'll notice that they overwhelmingly follow the same patterns. Now, rather than give you the same type of practice over and over again, let's take a second and look at this in a different way so you can see a different way this information might be presented. And that's, let's think about it backwards. We know that these reactions can be reversed through acetal hydrolysis. Hydrolysis just means breaking something with water. And in this case, we said when you add enough water to the acetal, it drives the equilibrium backwards through the hemiacetal, and most of the time all the way back to the original aldehyde or ketone and the alcohol. In essence, adding water to these reactions drives them backwards or breaks them up, so you get the original reactants you started with. That can be a really easy process when it's drawn out in a way that you recognize. And I want you to see, or I want you to have an opportunity to see what this looks like as a line structure, because they're actually really easy to start recognizing. The dead giveaway that you're looking at an acetal with a line structure is that acetals have two oxygens, both bonded to what was the carbonyl carbon. So if you think about the way we have been drawing these, we've typically had a carbon with two oxygens. If it's an acetal, each one of those oxygens has its own R group, and depending on whether we were looking at a ketone or an aldehyde, the carbon itself also has R groups. Again, this is an acetal. Let's think about how this looks as a line structure. I essentially have two different oxygens separated by one carbon. Now this can be a little bit tricky to draw out, but once you see it, you'll notice that it always tends to look the same. If I try to maintain the same orientation that I have here, I would notice that I have essentially a point connected to whatever my two R groups were. So if there are two R groups, they're both going to be drawn out connected to that carbon. Notice that the backbone of this molecule, as I change to a color that's a little bit easier to see, the backbone of this molecule is really the oxygen to carbon to oxygen. And what that looks like on a line structure is an oxygen to a point or an intersection to another oxygen. Whenever you see a carbon sandwiched between two oxygens, it's a good indication you're probably looking at an acetal. And in fact, sometimes line structures are the easiest thing to get reversed or to show how acetal hydrolysis happens. So let's look at a specific example. Let's say you come across this structure. One of the things about acetal line structures is, depending on how late at night it is and how hard you've been studying, they definitely start to look like things. People tell me they look like owls or headlights. But the reason that's true is because you're always looking at two oxygens that are separated by exactly one carbon. Again, if we go back and use the highlighter, here's the backbone part of the acetal, or here's the center of the molecule that makes it what it is. To figure out what this molecule must have been originally, realize that everything we've highlighted in yellow is really part of the carbonyl carbon and then that first new bond that was formed in the hemiacetal. And what I mean by that is you can make very short work of these by remembering what the original structures are like. Now, to make things a little bit easier, I'm just going to stick in a note here so that I don't forget that that carbon must have 4 bonds. So this carbon has a bond to the oxygen, a second bond to another oxygen, a bond to what must be a methyl group, and then it also must have a hydrogen because it has to have 4 bonds attached. That means that my original molecule must have been an aldehyde because I've just indicated that that carbon has at least 1 hydrogen attached to it. Now I can figure out what the rest of the molecule is by employing a little trick. When I look at this structure, if I remember that I formed an acetal from 2 alcohols and an aldehyde in this case, or 2 alcohols and a ketone in other cases, what I can realize is that the alcohols brought these oxygens with them. And because of that, I can figure out what their original structures are just by looking at what is connected to them on the side opposite the carbonyl carbon. This structure has an oxygen connected to a CH2 connected to a CH3. And during the reaction, I had lost the hydrogen. So I know that that's one of my original alcohols. On the other side, this alcohol has an oxygen connected to a CH2, connected to another CH2, and finally terminating at a CH3. And again, during the reaction, it lost the original hydrogen. So the two alcohols that must have been present for this acetal to form are propanol and ethanol. Now all I have to do is figure out what my original aldehyde or ketone was, and that's this structure here. As we said, we know that it's going to be an aldehyde because there must be a hydrogen connected to that carbonyl carbon. Let's move this structure so we can work with it for a second. The way I have it drawn here, I'm going to add in the oxygen so it's a little easier to see. There's also a line coming off it. That must represent a CH3. And we said that there's a hydrogen. Now, think about this in terms of hemiacetals. In a hemiacetal, we introduced a bond, and it doesn't matter which one you go for first, but we introduced a new bond between a carbon and an oxygen. So basically, to reverse the reaction, I have to get rid of this bond. And in fact, that oxygen is what's ended up on either the propanol or the ethanol. That means my remaining structure is the carbon double bonded to the oxygen with a CH3 on one side and an H on the other. So this structure here that looked so incredibly odd, or maybe looked like something depending on how late you're watching this, that structure I can now arrive at the conclusion that it must have been formed from propanol, ethanol, and acetaldehyde. And it must have been done in acidic conditions because it is an acetyl group. You can make up your own acetal practice questions just by trying to bond together any aldehyde or ketone and any one or two alcohols. If you use one alcohol, you'll either only get a hemiacetal or you'll have to use the same structure twice.